Hello, APUSH people. Welcome back for another dose of historical period number 4. So, today's lecture focuses specifically on social reform movements in the early 1800s, building on some things that we've talked before dealing with the Second Great Awakening, and looking at the effects of those, or I should say the effects of the Second Great Awakening in changing approaches in society. Alright, so the first thing we're talking about is the development of things called voluntary organizations. The principal one that you need to know is in red there on the left, known as the Temperance Movement. Alright, first of all, what you have to understand is this is during the early 1800s, during the Second Great Awakening, which allowed more women to get involved in the public sphere, outside the private sphere, in society a bit more. Now, they still are limited to where they could go. It had to be within the church, but increasingly, let me put this stuff up there, churches started working on charitable works. So it wasn't just the idea of attending church for religious purposes, but the Second Great Awakening developed this concept that through good works you could get to heaven. Okay, kind of sort of born again Christianity. Remember that oftentimes this new religious zeal that comes along with religious awakenings, that's what this is representing, and movement forward. Contributing to this as well is the fact that there is a developing middle class where women have their children going to school. There's not so much work to do on the farm or in the house as much, and more time for them to dedicate their time outside the home, but through these specific institutions. All right, the major movement that you need to know that falls under this is the Temperance Movement. Let's define this briefly. As a term, it means abstinence from alcohol, but let's look at the term temperance. When you ask someone to temper their stance, or even the idea of when you're sort of forging metal and you need to temper it, you need to basically make it more usable. You need to calm it down. You need to make it more moderate. And that's where the idea of abstinence from alcohol comes from. You're tempering your use of this substance to cope with life. All right. Now, some popular people and movements from the temperance movement. One major leader, his name was Lyman Beecher. Now, he wasn't just a big component of the temperance movement, but he had also formerly been I can't think of the word, a pastor, so someone who gave sermons during the Second Great Awakening. And we can see how the temperance movement and the Second Great Awakening are kind of merging and working together, promoting the same ideas, moving away from sin, which in this case meant moving away from the consumption of alcohol. Now, a very good representation of how people felt about alcohol and temperance within this movement is represented by this cartoon on the upper right. It's called The Drunkard's Progress. And we'll look at this in class at some point, but what it shows is it's kind of this slippery slope of going from having an occasional drink. Again, we'll go over it in class, but at the very end it has the image of this guy committing suicide by shooting himself in the head. Okay? All the while underneath this arch of, depravity is the poor wife and child suffering at home because of the sins of the father and the husband. So, there's not just this idea that people shouldn't drink alcohol, but that the use of alcohol is bad for your health and bad for your children and society. Okay? Oftentimes, these voluntary organizations and reform movements aren't just about reforming the self, it's about reforming society. And sometimes that can mean forcing others to follow your way of life. Okay, we're going to talk about this occasionally all the way through the 1920s. The temperance movement does not go away. It continues to be a popular reform movement. It comes to fruition with the 1920s and the Prohibition Amendment, the 18th Amendment. That backfires big time, but we'll get to that when we get to it. Okay, another type of reform movement had to do with reforming mental asylums and orphanages. So these were institutions in these days that there was no government regulation or sanitary standards of what happened there. So within mental asylums and orphanages, there was widespread abuse of these people who are basically, in one of the worst states of anyone could be, either mentally unstable, mentally handicapped, or orphanages, so children being taken advantage of. Now, this woman here to the right, her name was Dorothea Dix, and she took it upon herself to raise awareness of just the squalor of what was happening in those and trying to build a movement to improve the conditions in those. Now, did it work? Kind of. She didn't really see a lot of change to these institutions in her day, but she does start this movement of saying women can be out in public trying to fix the problems of society, like temperance, like mental asylums, like many other movements, trying to fix our problems and make life sort of free from sin, free from vice, free from the problems that mankind has put upon society. Good thing to note about all these voluntary movements has to do with that they were a middle class movement. The working class was not interested in participating in these, especially the temperance movement. So, the working class is working long hours, 6 days a week, every day but Sunday. Sunday they didn't work because there was still this tradition of it being the Sabbath. You go to church and you don't do things that day. But the working class said, oh my God, my life is horrible. What am I going to do on Sunday? I want to drink my sorrows away. And then you had these people in the temperance movement from the middle class saying, well, we're going to regulate that so you can't even drink those days. The working class was not interested in this. That's why I drew that distinction between not just reforming the self, but reforming society. And sometimes that side of reforming society meant some good deed doers trying to reform people who did not want to be reformed. All right? All right, another type of reform movement within this era is a seriously important one that we are going to be talking about now all the way through the Civil War, and that is abolitionism. So, abolitionism is the idea that slavery as an institution should be abolished. Okay, that's we can use the term abolish for anything, but within this time period, it is used specifically as this anti-slavery movement. So let's look at some data. From 1810 to 1840, the northern slave population drops significantly. Meanwhile, the southern slave population increases significantly. We have different economies, different societies going, basically diverging. They're traveling away from each other, and this is going to be a problem with the sectionalism that leads to the Civil War. Now, if we want to define abolitionism, it is the biggest, most important reform movement because of its influence and its role in the Civil War, and eventually the abolition of slavery with the 13th Amendment. But in addition to that, you need to understand that just because it is highly significant in American history does not mean it was very popular in its own time. It was considered very radical and very rare, especially in these early 1800s, that people were abolitionists. Let's look at some reasons why it was still considered radical for the time. Economically, the North was still benefiting from slavery. They relied on Southern cotton to be used in their textile production. Textile just means fabric. On top of that, the North, despite saying people starting to say that they didn't want slavery around because they didn't need it, still had a strict racial hierarchy. Most black people did not have rights in northern states, even though you had people saying they wanted slavery gone. Racism still abounded despite this growing movement, and politically, anti-slavery debates were forbidden in the government at this time. I believe I mentioned the gag rule in another presentation when we talked about John Quincy Adams. This was enforced, and that meant that anytime someone that had abolitionist leanings tried to bring up the debate of ending slavery in Congress, it could easily be tabled for further discussion at a later date, but this gag rule made it so that they could perpetually prevent it from being discussed. So, slavery was not changing in this era, but the North, at least among the more radical groups, the more liberal you could say at the time, were starting to turn against it. Now, some people that were turning against slavery were free blacks. An example is a guy named David Walker. He wrote, I forget if it was an article or an essay or a book, but it was kind of this appeal to the free peoples. He was an African-American individual appealing to other free blacks and slaves if they could get a hold of this literature to say, we need rapid change. The sort of system that's supporting slavery, as you can see above what we just said, it is in no position to change, and he called for violence in order to overthrow the system. Okay, so realize, yes, abolitionism was rare and radical, and it had a violent element to it. And this can be sort of embodied as well through something like Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. Now, Nat Turner was a slave, and because from the Second Great Awakening, there was a little bit greater access for black people to religion. The ideas, this religious fervor, American exceptionalism from the Second Great Awakening got to some slaves. So he claimed that Jesus came to him and visited him, told him that he should rebel, kill his masters, rally the slaves, go to other plantations, kill the masters, and have this widespread rebellion to end slavery. Now, we've talked about slave rebellions before, and as I said before, they always end the same way. Some whites are killed. Ultimately, more blacks are executed in response to the whites being killed. And let's see if you remember what happens after that. Stricter slave laws. So you would think by now that all sort of things that slaves or blacks had access to in these southern states would be gone, but they found ways to make them even stricter. All right, let's look at another abolitionist, a guy named William Lloyd Garrison. He was from the North, from Massachusetts, and he's really one of the most famous abolitionists. Now, something I have to point out, a lot of people assume that abolitionists at the time were only black, so it makes sense that black people would be fighting for rights for themselves and for others in sort of this subjugated place as them, but there were white people too. William Lloyd Garrison was white. He was just a skinny old white dude up from the North, okay? I've taught this too many times where people say he was black, and I just want to make it clear. So, why is he famous? He published a newspaper for over 30 years whose sole goal was to abolish slavery. It was called The Liberator, okay? His very first issue called for the immediate end to slavery, and he was uncompromising. We'll look at one of these documents at some point, whether it's in a quiz or in class, but he says that he will not equivocate. He will not back down from his point of view. He uses this language of just how serious the issue is. At one point he says, if your house was on fire, you would not say, we can put out the fire later. Don't bother to call the firemen. He even says, if your wife was being raped, you wouldn't say, we could wait till it's all over to take care of this. No, these are serious matters that need serious solutions and responses, and he says, this is why I am so passionate. Slavery is an immoral evil. Why is nobody angry as I am? Everyone should be angry as I am. Okay, so he was considered a radical, just as I said, abolitionists were considered so, and he forms one of these first anti-slavery societies in order to start getting people who were opposed to slavery united with common goals. All right, we'll be revisiting this topic several times all the way through the Civil War. All right, our last slide right here is about the start of a women's rights movement. Okay, so let's give a little bit of background. Remember, we've talked about the Second Great Awakening. We've talked about how women had increased social involvement because greater church involvement allowed them to be involved in society more. There was a changing relationship between the private and public spheres, and what happened is so many women got involved in this that they started to say to themselves, we're so busy trying to help other people, why aren't we trying to help ourselves in the process too? We're trying to get rid of slavery, greater rights for African Americans. We're trying to get rid of the use of alcohol, make society a more peaceful, a more temperate area. And we're trying to spread our religion, try to spread education. Hey, we don't have any rights either. So women start to get together and say, we need to work on ourselves as well. So there's some things I already mentioned right there. Really the way to think about this is going from greater religious participation, social participation, political participation. This means a women's rights movement was really the next logical step in the minds of many women. Okay? And where this all converges after a lot of sort of disjointed local organizations, everything converges on Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. Now remember, New York was a growing state, and it was really the central area when we talk about the Second Great Awakening. 1848 is when this occurred. So, leaders from all over the nation of women's rights movement came together in New York to figure out what are their goals. And in many ways, their sort of meeting here parallels or mirrors, however you want to set that up, the Second Continental Congress during the American Revolution. Major leaders who are involved in a movement coming together to say, we need unified goals, we need a statement of what we're trying to do. Some famous people at this meeting: Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and Frederick Douglass. So there were men at this meeting. Frederick Douglass, in his case, was more of an abolitionist. But just as he said women are helping the abolitionist movement, he said we should all be looking out for each other. I, as a former slave, as an African American, as a man, need to be looking out for women's rights as well. Really, when we think of sort of women's rights, our human rights, our African American rights, they were all in the same boat. So what did they do there? They drafted something called the Declaration of Sentiments, which we will look at in class, and it sets out distinct goals and grievances about why they're doing what they're doing. And in fact, you'll notice this when we look at it, it basically takes the Declaration of Independence, a lot of the same wording and structure, and shifts it a little bit to reflect women's interests. So, let's see if you can remember this. Go all the way back to the Declaration of Independence, right? You've got the preamble, all men are created equal. What would this one have said? All men and women are created equal, putting them in that place. What did the Declaration do next? It talked about how the king had been a tyrant against them, and then listing out the grievances of he's done this, he's done that, he's done this, with he being the king. Now, next logical step in the Declaration of Sentiments, who is the he in this case? Man. What has the patriarchy done to keep women where they are and prevent them from exercising their unalienable rights as well? So it basically turns this important document not on its head, but certainly shifts it a bit to say, this didn't protect all of us. We need to defend ourselves if you're not going to do so. All right, thank you for watching as always. There are your next steps to keep up on your work. Hope you enjoyed this one, and see you next time.